Hello, welcome to this DCS A-10C2 tutorial. In this video, I'll be talking about SPIs, sensor points of interest, and also your targeting pod. So to begin, SPIs, your sensor point of interest, is essentially the location where your sensors are focused on and what you'll be utilizing to target your weapons. I briefly mentioned in previous videos that the three-tiered wedding cake symbol was a SPI. Let's go ahead and set one up right now. I'll throw a mark point, put myself in mark point mode. I'll throw a mark point right in front of my plane here. We can use as an example. All right, so I have mark point A, currently my SPI with the three-tiered wedding cake. And we can see it here. In the lower left of our HUD, it is telling us what sensor our SPI is coming from. In this case, it is coming from our steer point. So if I put another mark point out in front of me, and I cycle to it, make my HUD my soy, DMS up, mark point B. Now mark point B is my current SPI given to me by my steer point. You can give your SPIs, your plane a SPI from all different kinds of sensors as it is a sensor point of interest. In this video, we'll keep it to the basics and talk about utilizing steer point and targeting pod SPIs. We can get into the more advanced functions in a later video, but I don't want this to be an hour-long video. Alright, so that's fine and dandy. We have our steer point SPI. Let's get our targeting pod up. So I will come to the targeting pod page. And if you followed our startup, your targeting pod should already be on after you loaded your plane. You'll see it is not soy, so I'll go ahead and make it soy. After I put it to air to ground mode, you'll see it's in standby here. Just click air to ground, and now I can make it my sensor of interest. At this point, we now see a box on our HUD, and this is telling us where our targeting pod is looking. And the bounds of this box tell us what is being shown on our display. So this entire display, covers the bounds of this box. With my targeting pod as my sensor of interest, I can press DMS, Display Management Switch forward, to zoom in. You see the box gets smaller, and Display Management Switch aft to zoom out, and the box gets bigger. If I want to move my targeting pod around, I can utilize my cursor controller, and you see I can move it all around. If I wanted to change the zoom level, we currently see I'm in a wide zoom. I can short press China hat forward, and now I'm in a narrow view. If I press China hat short press forward again, it will toggle. And the narrow view will be within the bounds of these corners of this box. So if I zoom into narrow, it encompasses that. And if I go back to wide, we'll see that. So if I go narrow, we can see it zooms in, and I have even more of a zoom level. I can zoom out again, and then go back to wide. Nice and easy. If I want to change it, the view mode of the targeting pod, we can see it's currently in CCD. I can hit my boat switch forward, aft, or center. Boat switch, forward, aft, center. And that will change me between black hat, white hat, or CCD, which is TV. So forward, black hat, aft white hot, center TV, shown in the upper right. You can change your view for your targeting pod depending on your preferences for your situation and what's going on. If you press China hat back short a click, you'll see this symbology come up. L search. This is utilized for buddy lasing, and we'll cover that in a later air-to-ground video. So it's fine and dandy that we can look around with our targeting pod, but our current SPI is still our steer point, which means our weapon targeting will be on whatever that wedding cake is, which happens to be mark point B as our steer point. In order to make our targeting pod our SPI, our sensor point of interest, with our targeting pod as our SOI, sensor of interest, we will press and hold TMS, target management switch, forward. At that point, we will see our SPI has changed off of steer point to now TGP, targeting pod. Because we changed our SPI to our targeting point, our targeting pod, this line in our HUD, since it always tells us the direction of our SPI, is now telling us where our targeting pod is looking. Extremely useful feature. So if you have your targeting pod as SPI, which is how we'll be engaging 99% of our weapons, our HUD will point us towards our targeting pod. If we want to move our targeting pod to our mark point, we can press and hold China hat aft, and it will slave our targeting pod to our currently selected steer point, in this case, mark point B. I can go my HUD sensor of interest, cycle to mark point A, and it will move it to mark point A, cycle to mark point B, and it put it back to mark point B. If you no longer want it slaved to your current steer point, we can just move the targeting pod, make it our sensor of interest, and we can move it again, and it will no longer be locked. That way we can change our currently selected mark point, and it won't affect our targeting pod. Once again, if I want my targeting pod to be slaved to my current mark point or steer point, I will make it my sensor of interest, long press and hold China hat aft, and now it is slaved to our mark point. Cycling our mark points while it is slaved will move where our targeting pod is looking. If I move my targeting pod, making it sensor of interest, it is no longer slaved to my mark point, and when I change my mark point, it no longer moves my targeting pod. If you do not want your targeting pod as your SPI, we can do a long press aft on our target management switch, TMS, and it will change our SPI, our sensor point of interest, back to steer point. Generally, I'm just going to keep my targeting pod as my SPI because that'll allow me to engage with all of the functions. I can put this on an area, have my helmet point me to it, or I can utilize the long hold China hat aft and have it slave itself to the mark point. So we never really need our steer point as our SPI. We can just utilize our targeting pod as our SPI and still have all of the functionalities we would have as if we had our steer point as our SPI. Alrighty, now let's actually start looking at some stuff with our targeting pod. With our targeting pod, as our SPI. We can move it around and we see our wedding cake moving with our targeting pod, since that is our sensor point of interest. And I can create a mark point with my targeting pod by pressing TMS right short, just like we could on our TAD during the navigation tutorials. And we can easily mark things that we want to investigate later. TMS right short to make a mark point with our targeting pod as our SPI. Alright, so I'll move my targeting pod in that area. And we can see it might be a little hard to distinguish heat sources. I'm currently in black hot mode. We can change the display contrast and brightness by utilizing the contrast and brightness rockers on the side. So I'll go ahead and adjust that to my liking. Alrighty, so you can see I'm at the maximum zoom level here, shown by the bounds of this box. And it's a little hard to distinguish details, but I can see because of my contrast and brightness settings, there are some specks down here because I'm in black hot, black specks. So what I'm going to do is move my targeting pod over the area I want to investigate. I can zoom in with DMS forward, zoom out with DMS, display management switch aft, or toggle the zoom level from wide to narrow by pressing China hat forward short. So we can see those specs were actually vehicles. And I can fine tune it even more now that I actually have something to make them pop a bit more. So we can see those vehicles down there. So if I wanted to mark a target, I can put this crosshair over the target, TMS, target management switch, right short, and now I put a mark point over that target. So say I moved my targeting pod off to some random area, and I want to get it back to that target, in this case, mark point E. I can press and hold my China hat aft long, slave my targeting pod to my current mark point, and then change my current mark point to, in that case, E for that target. And now I am back on that target. Very useful feature that will come in handy for bombing and ground attacks later. Now, as you're flying, a benefit of this A-10C2 Scorpion helmet is the fact that we can display what our targeting pod sees in our helmet in addition to on the targeting pod page itself. In order to do that, we will make our helmet our sensor of interest with coolie hat aft, and then I can do a short press left on the DMS display management switch, and that will turn on a view of our targeting pod in our helmet. So we can slew the targeting pod around and see what it sees, making it our sensor of interest, even without looking at the target or our display inside the plane. Very useful feature. So if you're looking at a target like this, we can have a detailed view based on our targeting pod in our helmet without ever having to look inside of our plane. Alrighty. So keep in mind that whenever we're doing all of these basic tutorials, 99.9% of the time, we're going to be utilizing our targeting pod SB. Once again, we can get back to a steer point SPI by doing a long press aft on the target management switch, and it's back to steer point. And to make our targeting pod our SPI, we will make our targeting pod our sensor of interest and do a long press forward on the TMS. Long press forward on the TMS will generally make whatever sensor you currently have selected your SPI. But for now, as we're learning and keeping it to the basics, we're always going to keep our targeting pod as our SPI. I'll go ahead and find one more target as an example. You can slew the targeting pod around as you're looking at it. Start looking for something. And this time I'll go white hot mode. Get below the clouds, since the clouds can get in the way of our targeting pod. And your targeting pod can be blocked by your plane, as you can kind of see here on the outer edge. So keep that in mind depending on where you're going. Alrighty, because I'm now in white hot, I'm going to adjust my keying in contrast again. And we can see some white specks out here because we're now in white hot, so I'll zoom in. And here are the vehicles. Here we can see that our targeting pod with these crosses is in an area track, so it's going to be pointed at whatever area on the ground our crosshairs are looking at. If I do a short press forward on my TMS, target management switch, with my targeting pod as sensor of interest, it changes to a point track mode. Point track mode will lock on to whatever contrast the targeting pod is seeing. So if I go into an area track, move my crosshair over a vehicle, and then put it into a point track mode, the targeting pod will now follow whatever the vehicle or target is. This is useful for tracking a moving target. Just remember, whenever you are finding a target, do a TMS short press up to be sure you're in area mode. Utilize area for finding a target. And then when you're actually going in for an attack run, we'll put it over the target and put it into a point track mode. This can be extremely sensitive when you're zoomed out, so always zoom in and it'll make life a little easier. So again, we can go black hot, white hot, TV, and you can just adjust the gain and contrast rockers, or brightness and contrast rockers, to your liking. Alright, that is the extreme basics of utilizing a targeting pod and a steer point as a SPI. These are the techniques we'll use for the basic bombing and weapons tutorials to follow, so make sure you have a solid grasp on being able to make your targeting pod your SPI, and then find a target with your targeting pod before you try and attempt to start bombing things. We'll cover very much more in-depth and advanced uses of SPIs and your different sensors in your plane in a later video. But as I said earlier, this is going to be used 99% of the time. Thanks for watching.